This is Mr. Smith, and today we're going to be looking at the rise of the Soviet Union and whether or not it was fascist. Um, First of all, we need to figure out what Marxism is and what fascism is. So take a second and pause the video if you need to review what fascism is. But together, let's figure out what Marxism is. So first of all, Karl Marx, where the word Marxism comes from, was really a philosopher um, who wrote about many different things throughout his life. Um, he was born in what would later become Germany, but he died in London and he was stateless, which basically meant nobody would take him. Um, and you can see why that might be the case after we learn a little bit more about his ideas. So, Marx basically advocated for the overthrow of capitalist systems in order to establish eventually communist systems. Um, he grew up during the Industrial Revolution, he lived during the Industrial Revolution, and he witnessed an increasing gap between the rich and the poor. Those who owned property and owned factories, and those who worked them. He called the rich the bourgeoisie and the poor the proletariat, and you probably recognize these terms from the French Revolution. And according to him, in industrial capitalism, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, and this led to things like imperialism. So he advocated for the overthrow of capitalist systems in order to create a new system called socialism. And this is how he defined socialism. It's a system in which the people, through the governments, um, own natural resources, property, and businesses. Okay, so in other words, the government, which is like the system in which the people are represented, actually controls to some degree natural resources, property, and businesses. So this is different from pure capitalism, in which private ownership of natural resources and property and businesses exists. So Marx thought this would be accomplished in really two steps. So the first step was education of the proletariat. As the poor became more knowledgeable about business, about government, about science, they would have the capability to run a government and to run a business. So the first step was education. So good so far. But the second step was violent revolution. So he advocated for overthrowing the government that supported industrial capitalism and installing something else, which would be socialism. So today, we see a lot of places that have socialism in some way, shape, or form. Marx thought that socialism would basically be a system where workers get rights, including like living wages and benefits, free public education, healthcare. So, through government ownership of these things, workers and the people basically would receive benefit. The way they would pay for this is high taxes and less private ownership. So, although this is a little unclear from Marx's ideas, basically, public ownership of these resources would be redistributed in the form of benefits for the people. Now, today, there's lots of socialist parties throughout the world, and they really are advocating for like less gap between rich and the poor. And the way they would do this is by taxing businesses, taxing wealthy individuals, and redistributing that wealth, and also by controlling private businesses to some degree to make sure that the workers aren't exploited. And most wealthy nations today have some form of socialism, including the U.S. The U.S. has things like Social Security, public education, and the only difference, though, is that these countries have achieved some degree of socialism without violent revolution. Marx, on the other hand, advocated for a violent revolution, and this is what the Soviet Union would do. Now, Marx now advocated for a second step, which is moving from socialism to a new thing called communism. And communism is a utopian system. It's a perfect system where not only do workers receive a share of the resources, they also get to help decide what happens to those, or decide how businesses are run, decide how government is run, and all wealth then is shared among the workers. So there's no rich and there's no poor. Now, the way this would be accomplished is through two more steps. The proletariat would push out the bourgeoisie. And Marx said that one way to do this would be to imprison them or to execute them. So in Marx's time, the bourgeoisie would be like 10% of the population in a lot of countries. So he was basically advocating for the murder of 10% of the population. Now, from there, Marx said that the society would eventually evolve into a classless one, in which everyone is a worker and everyone has a say in the government. At this point, all the workers are educated, so supposedly they would know how to actually run a government, and they would be smart enough to not just murder one another and yada yada. Socialism becomes communism. So this is Marx's idea. We will see that throughout history, no country so far as we know, has ever been able to accomplish A, B, C, and D. They've tried. So, for instance, the French revolutionaries tried A and C. They tried to educate the public and then overthrow the government and then push out the bourgeoisie, but we know it didn't evolve into a classless one. The USSR would claim to be the first fully communist nation, and we're going to figure out if it actually was. Was it communist? Was it fascist? Okay. So let's take a look at how the USSR came to be. Before the revolutions in the 20th century, let's just review what Russia was. First of all, it was a monarchy, but right before the revolution, it was a constitutional monarchy, which meant that there was a Congress that made decisions that Nicholas II, who was the Tsar at the time, had to at least somewhat listen to. So it was a constitutional monarchy, meaning it was ruled by a dictator, but there was a Congress that helped him make decisions. It was also socially stratified, which meant that landowners, who were known as kulaks, wealthy landowners in Russia, and the monarchy were at the top. Clergy came next, then the urban bourgeoisie, which was merchants, professionals, factory owners, and then the proletariat, which would be on farms, that's former serfs, and then urban factory workers. By the time of the revolution, there really was not industrialization taking place that much. Between 1905 and 1917, when the Russian Revolution happened, the Tsar tried to rapidly industrialize to kind of make up for the butt kicking they got by Japan. But by the time of the Russian Revolution, most of Russia was still rural, meaning farmland. Now, let's take a look at Vladimir Lenin. So Lenin was a member of a socialist party, which advocated for basically the government owning natural resources and businesses. He was part of a Marxist party known as the, it had a very long name. It was the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. But Lenin actually advocated for a more extremist version of this, and his faction or his group of the party became the Bolsheviks. They broke away from the party. This is Lenin here at the meeting with the Bolsheviks in 1912. Now, what happened during the Russian Revolution is the Bolsheviks were the ones who actually gained control of the Russian state. Lenin became the new head of the government, and the Bolsheviks would eventually become the Communist Party. So the Communist Party in the USSR was really an evolution of the Bolsheviks. Now, right after the Russian Revolution, during the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks fought against people who sympathized with the old Tsar and the old Russian regime. They also fought against foreign agents from places like the United States and Britain who tried to overthrow the communist government for reasons we've already discussed. During the Russian Civil War, a lot of people were executed on both sides. For instance, the Reds executed Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family. Mass executions took place, and this is going to become a common theme in the USSR. The Bolsheviks won out, and the Reds, who were the Bolsheviks, declared the USSR, which was a new communist, according to Lenin, government, and Lenin would be the head of the government until it became a perfect classless society. Just for some reference, Soviet is the Russian name for the Democratic Workers' Council or Union. Now, Soviet imperialism was a key part of this because in order to make money, a communist system basically has to exploit the environment. That's really the only way they can make money, is they have to live off the land. But according to Lenin and even Marx, in order to become communist, you first have to dabble with capitalism. So what the Soviets wanted to do was expand so that they could get some valuable lands that had things like farm and oil and lumber. So one big area was the Ukraine, which had farmland. So the Soviet Union wanted to expand, and its method of expansion was either through Soviet republics, which were under direct control. That would include places like Lithuania and Latvia, and then independent nations, places like, for instance, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And these terms would change kind of throughout the Soviet Union's history depending on who was behaving and who was